Welcome everyone to our class on growing low-light indoor plants with Taylor Cochran. He's an assistant manager at our Slope Boulevard location, and he's worked for the company for many years and is always a wealth of information for indoor plants. Thank you for joining us, and Taylor, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jen. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining today for the live recording and everyone watching it in the future. I am glad that you clicked on this video and are going to learn about some low light plants. There is a lot of knowledge and a lot of information here that I'm going to go through. And so if you need to go back and look at it or rewind, it's definitely some good information, and we'll answer some questions at the end. So we'll definitely have a lot to talk about. Again, my name is Taylor, and I am someone who grows plants avidly. I love them. I have a lot of house plants. You can see many behind me if you see my little thumbnail, as well as I have a lot of outdoor plants too. But I've been growing them for a good maybe 7 to 8 years now, pretty consistently. My collection has grown a whole bunch, and I've learned a lot. And I've learned a lot from you. I've learned a lot from my colleagues, and so I really am. I'm here to share as much as I can and give you some tips and tricks about how to take care of them. But let's go and talk really about low light plants. So why do we grow them? Why do we grow these plants that are actually more adapted to these lower light conditions? And there's a couple different reasons, of course, and it's all very personal. But one main thing is they can tolerate our average indoor climate, which means that they can live in our households, they can live in our temperatures, they can live in our generally our light levels. In a variation, we're going to talk a lot about that today. We can care for them pretty easily, but they are plants that actually survive indoors. No plant is actually a house plant in nature. They are all plants, of course. They are growing in nature in whatever area in the world that they actually are coming from, but then we bring them into our house, so we make them a house plant. So they have to survive in these conditions. Low light plants in general also fit an area that many other plants that we do bring inside don't actually fit. They are plants that can be put in the corner of your room, behind your couch, next to a TV that's maybe not right next to a window, up on the shelf really up high, somewhere that is, you want some green, something to really fill it, bring some life into the corner of the room, but maybe you can't put your bright cactus or one of your like yuccas or one of your other plants or larger palms that maybe need a little bit more sun. These are plants that actually survive in those areas. So it's one good reason to fill a space that others can't. They've been cited as clean the air plants pretty heavily. I think actually most plants that people usually cite as cleaning the air plants are within that lower light category. It's a bit of a controversial kind of topic in a lot of different ways, so we don't want to step on that one too much. But in general, if you are looking for one of those clean the air plants, generally, if you go for a low light plant, you kind of hit the ticket there. And they also have a huge variety of foliage, generally on the green side, generally on the darker green side, but they have different shapes and sizes. I have some pictures here on the side, of course, like the larger monsteras that actually have a huge range of light levels. There's really spiky little plants and succulents and different kinds of sansevierias and other kinds like that. There's even some bright coloration that you can get, not as often, but if you find a really bright pink plant that can actually grow in a semi-shaded area, it's kind of awesome, as well as different kinds of variegations and other kinds of shapes and sizes. So although they are a bit more of a niche category in some ways, they have a huge variety. There are so many plants out there that actually grow. So definitely look around your garden centers, ask people who grow plants, ask people from those garden centers what they like, what are some cool new varieties or some varieties that they really take good care of. And you'll find a wealth of plant styles and types. And of course, right at the bottom, plants bring us joy. There is so much more information and actual like legit studies on how much plants actually sociologically like make us feel happy and bring joy to us than the cleaning the air stuff. So it actually is a larger science about the happiness that they bring into your life. So have plants around you. They actually will increase your mood in a lot of ways. And taking care of something is always a way to bring yourself up as well. So lots of reasons why to grow them. And let's get into actually kind of taking care of them. So this class is really about light, right? So what is light even good for? Do we really need it? These plants require low light. Do they actually really need light? Yes, of course. Photosynthesis is the biggest thing that we need to talk about. And I'm not going to get nitty gritty into the science of photosynthesis. It's a wonderful and amazing process that these plants have developed and adapted over many years since the beginning of our world being really breathable and livable for a lot of life. But in general, the main thing we need to know is that when light comes in from our sun and it hits these plants, they have these chloroplasts inside their cells that have these different kinds of pigments, mainly of chlorophyll, but there's other kind of pigments too. And the light excites those electrons that break apart the water inside those cells. And then those electrons move through this system that actually pumps all these different kind of chemicals and different kinds of atoms around that create energy. And so if you remember back to any of your biology classes or ever talked about the biology of a lot of living systems, ATP is our internal energy that we use for doing lots of things. Plants use that energy to make their sugars, which is what they use to make all their structures. All the parts of the plant come from them having energy, and that energy comes from our sun. So, of course, light is always important, although these plants have adapted to lower light situations. They still, of course, need some. You can't put them in a dark room and say, please live inside this closet. It has to be out somewhere that actually does get some photons, get some light. I am a big proponent to having them get natural lighting from the sun. I feel like that is the full spectrum. It really gives the plants the best case scenario for the light for their photosynthesis. There are lots of different kinds of growing light situations. I think grow lights are really great. And if you know how to use them, if you use them really well, they can be fantastic. I don't actually use them very much, so I can't speak on them that much, but I've seen a lot of friends and people who use them quite well. And fluorescent lighting and just normal kinds of lighting can do some stuff. Of course, they're adding photons to the air. They're giving the plant some energy, but it's generally not the same as a good bright sunlight or even dappled sunlight from the sun. Those adaptive structures that I was talking about can actually really appear in these low light plants differently than a lot of other plants. And this is a wide variety of things we can talk about here, but I'm going to try and simplify it down a little bit more. But low light plants generally have darker leaves, darker kind of green structure leaves. Their pigments are arranged in a certain way. They've adapted over years to actually have these pigments be kind of the most efficient possible as they can be. Their surface area is generally bigger, so a lot of times you have a larger surface area. If you look on the right side of this page, or however direction you're looking at, you have the Monstera deliciosa. I put that there just in case you're kind of bored by the science stuff. You get to look at a really pretty, beautiful Monstera deliciosa when it's huge leaf. I mean, that leaf is this big. It's right now sitting in our store, ready to be bought by someone who wants to take care of it. But of course, that leaf probably needs more light than some of the ones that we're going to talk about. But in general, those plants can be a lower light plant. They can adapt to those situations. But they like a big, broad leaf as well as these densely packed photosystems. So it's all about having the most efficient way of gathering light the plant can have, so that when it's sitting in a shady area or maybe underneath a tree in a rainforest or wherever it is that's been adapted to be in these lower light situations, if a sun ray comes by or some photons make its way to that leaf, it can grab them, it can use it can make that ATP and that energy right away. But on the flip side, it also is one reason why we have to be careful not to put some of these lower adaptive plants in our really sunny parts of our houses or sunny parts of our gardens, because all these adapted structures are setting the plant up for success in a lower light situation. And if you're like, oh, well, maybe let's give it some more light to really help it out, those photosystems probably for a few seconds get really excited. And they're like, oh, wow, look at all this sunlight that we got. And then they sit there and they're like, oh, no, it's still coming. It's really, really bright. And that actually overexcites them. They start to break down. They start to denature. That's how you get burning. That's how you get bleaching on your leaves or crispy leaves or dieback in your plant in general from a highlight situations, because those plants are like, they're ready to take up as much light as they can get. But then when they get too much, it's a little bit too much for them. So understanding that kind of structural adaptation is really helpful for thinking about where you should put the plants in your house. And I'm gonna have a little note about auxin. It is a plant hormone that regulates the size and length of the internodes, the spaces in between the leaves, as well as the direction that the plant grows. So if it's growing towards the sun, that is because the auxin hormone is actually it's a complicated system. We're not going to talk a lot about it. I think it's really fascinating, but it is why plants will stretch in shady situations. It is why you saw your succulent stretching if it's trying to like grow towards the light and get kind of long and leggy. It is why you have your different kinds of pothos or different kinds of leafy greens that have these long internodes between them. They're getting really long and leggy. It's because that plant is stretching, and that is from this hormone called auxin, and is being affected by the light that it's getting. that's enough about the nitty gritty kind of science stuff. And if you really want to learn more about that, I totally implore you to go deep into those parts of the internet or those kinds of studies, because I think it's really cool. But we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about plants. Let's all talk really about location. So it is all about location, 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 right? We are in a class right now talking about lower light plants. And so we really need to talk about where you're putting your plants and why you want to plant in that situation and what kind of light it's really getting. The first thing that I ask anyone when they come into our store and they're like, I would love a plant in my bathroom, or I would love a plant next to my bed, or I really want one that's going to grow big, or whatever kind of question they ask me for looking for a really cool plants. And I'm thinking through my head all these different kinds of plants I can show them. The first question I ask them is, what direction is the light coming from? Where is the light filling your room? What direction is your window facing? Because that really tells me how much light you're going to get generally during what parts of the day and what kind of light that is. I have a little compass over here to just kind of have a bit of a image kind of way of thinking about it. So the fullest sun area is right in your southern facing windows. So the places that face south, that's south for me right there, get sun for most of the day. In the morning, they can get a fair bit of sun. And if it's not blocked by anything else, towards the afternoon, it's getting a lot of sun too, especially right now we're in the winter seasons, or the fallish winter seasons of the year, and the sun is a lot lower, but it's still hitting that southern side, that southern exposure a lot more than anything else. The northern exposure and the northern facing windows generally don't get a lot of direct sunlight. They do get a lot of ambient light. It can still be a fairly bright window. Your plants can still survive quite well in a north facing window. But those windows are usually the ones that I'll talk to people directly about the lower light requiring plants compared to anything else, because I know they're not going to get a lot of direct sunlight. They're only going to get a bit of dappled sunlight. Really, summer is the only time that's really that bright in that area. So the northern facing is less, the southern facing is a lot more. East and west have a lot more kind of variability because they're getting sun at different times of the day, and that's a different kind of sun. Your morning sun coming from the east is a lot warmer. Well, no, warm is the wrong word. It's a lot softer. I think it is being blocked by a lot more particles in the air. The dew from the morning kind of climate, or just in general, the sun is slowly warming up the side of the earth that you're on. In that morning sun, your plants actually get a fair bit of sunlight, but it's not beating down on them just yet. Midday, it's getting pretty hot and they're actually getting a lot of sun if they're getting the light, but generally indoors, usually our ceilings are blocking that. And then your west facing windows are the ones that are facing, for us, it's towards the ocean. And that's your afternoon sun, that when the sun is actually coming down and all the particles in the air are mostly burning off, and your plants has probably been getting light for a good while at this point. So it's actually taking a lot of sun from that area. And so west facing light is generally thought of as one of the hottest sunlights as well. And more often a bright light plant does better there. Thinking about this in general, if you have a low light plant, if you have a north facing place, it's usually pretty good for them. I think an east facing window is great for almost any plant. You can grow low light plants and higher light plants in east facing windows. South facing, west facing really depends on the barriers and how much sun actually gets through that window and touches your plant. And in general, a lot of these plants that we're going to talk about, they don't need that direct sunlight either. If the sunlight's coming into a west facing window and it's bright, but your plant is 10 feet across the room, you're generally going to be pretty set up for the plant to actually do pretty well. It's not going to get all that direct sunlight stopping it. I'm going to show you just really quickly. This is my room. If you would see here, I have a south facing window right there. And then right behind my camera, I actually have two east facing windows. I'm really lucky, and this is why this room is full of plants, is the room I'm most happy in, because in the morning I get a lot of sun coming from the east. And then even some of my south facing windows are getting a lot of sun from that morning sun. And then in the afternoon, I have sun coming in from those south facing windows, blanketing the room as well, and a fair bit of light. So I have light all throughout the day, but I have a lot of plants right by my windows. And then I have a lot of plants on the opposite side of my room, which is actually in the darker, kind of dimmer areas. In this picture, let's go back to sharing. Well, hello, me. There we go. Back.
Taylor, one of these classes you have to do a tour of your room there. I think we all want to see all the plants.
all the
It's
plants and
very
stuff. I know
cool.
I'll have to
Yeah,
do a bit of a swing.
super
There's
cool.
a lot going on here. Some of it's
Mhm.
kind of crazy, but I try and fill almost every surface in this room with plants. It's just
I can tell.
what I like to do. And it's a good way of actually, it's a good way of me figuring out what kind of light the plants need, because I have so much different kinds of light in this room, that areas that are right by the window on my desk versus areas that are on the desk across the room, or even in the top parts of my room on the little ledges I have. They get very different lighting, and I can actually grow different plants there. I'll show you a little more soon. In this picture right here, I actually have, this is in the room right now, is to my left. It is a east-facing door that has a window on it that's giving this bright light onto these generally actually fairly bright light to moderate light plants. I mean, it's a very big variety here, and it really shows you that there's not one perfect lighting for any plant. A plant adapts generally to its lighting, and when it gets more sun, it can grow structures that are maybe more vibrant or more densely packed, or the plant grows a little bit differently, where if it gets actually a little bit less sun, it stretches out more, it gets a little bit deeper kind of color, maybe gets a little bit bigger leaves for certain reasons. There's different kind of ways that the plants grow depending on the light. And I have a variety of plants here that actually have all, I would say, very different capabilities of light aspects, but they do great. Like I said, an east-facing window is probably one of my favorite places to grow a plant. All right. Let's move on to 3 categories of plants that I wanted to bring up today to really kind of narrow down and give you some options or something to really look at when you go into a plant store to get a new plant. And then the things that we're talking about with these plants can pertain to a whole slew of them, but we're going to use examples as a way to kind of learn today. So we're starting first with the tried and true, the one that probably everyone knows about at some point or has heard about, the Sansevieria, or the snake plant. There are so many of these plants. There are so many varieties. They are well cultivated within our cultures and our plant kind of areas these days, because they can do really well for us. They can do really well indoors. They are very easy to take care of. I have right up here, it's considered one of the easiest plants to grow. If you come into our store and you say, hey, I don't really take care of plants very much, or hey, I don't have very much sun, I'm not really sure how to take care of these plants, the first one I will walk towards is a Sansevieria, and is why we are starting with it today. I know if you're an avid plant grower, this may be a little bit of an old hat, or you not really want to talk too much about Sansevieria, but I think there's so much we can learn from them, and there are so many different kinds of varieties that they are very beautiful in their own way. I have this picture right here of a display we have in our store with a whole bunch of different varieties, some with yellow, some with more silvers, some are a little bit more thin or darker. There's all these different kinds here that actually are really providing a cool screen. You can actually have a very structural plant in your house that can just sit in the corner of your room or right behind your couch that maybe doesn't get so much sun, but it's providing this green, stable aspect to the home decor that is living and actually, gives you energy and gives you, both in the sense maybe cleaning the air as well as a whole bunch of happiness. One little note that I like to bring up, but also kind of don't like very much, is Dracaenas, or the Sansevierias have actually been reclassified into the Dracaena genus. So technically they're all Dracaenas. I haven't found any gardener or any plant person that really says that or actually goes by that name just yet, but I'm guessing that over the next couple of years, we're going to start transitioning into calling them Dracaenas. But for now, they are Sansevierias, and I would just call them a snake plant. I've also heard mother-in-law's tongue and a few other names for them. People always call them different things. But in general, the main kind of takeaway I want to get around for this plant is it is a low light plant, but it actually requires really low water. It is why I would consider it one of the easiest plants. It likes to go very much close to bone dry. You can let these plants sit for maybe 2 weeks to a month, and you can just not water at all during that time period, and it'll be totally fine. It'll be stable, it'll be stationary, it'll be there, it'll be happy. It might get a little bit dusty if you don't look at it or wipe it off every once in a while. Plants that I find that you don't have to water very often get the most dusty because you're not looking at them as much, but come in, wipe them off every once in a while, and they'll be quite happy even when they get pretty dry. And that also is their type of soil that they prefer. They prefer a higher drainage soil. You hear that all the time in the plant world. Everyone talks about a high drainage soil. And that usually means it is rockier or chunkier or has all these pathways for the water to move through it really easily. It still has a good amount of water retention. There's those different kinds of compounds of bark or perlite, or even just different kinds of soils or whatever's inside there are still pulling in water and holding that water for the plant to take up. But the water can move through that soil really easily and can exit out the hole in the bottom. Please have drainage holes in your plants. It is quite necessary. But the water leaves through those drainage holes in the bottom, and the plant now has enough water, but it's not sitting in water. They do not like to sit in a soggy soil or anything like that for very long. These root structures can take up as much water as they can, and then once they're done taking up water, they don't want the water to sit in there anymore. No wet feet, as one of my colleagues always says. But I also wanted to show off right here on the side that Sansevierias grow their new structures from their roots and grow out. They don't branch or grow from the top of their growing node areas. They grow from the soil or from little connection points in the root structures that grow new clusters, I guess I would call them, new clusters in the pot that kind of fill up the pot over time. They will also grow from the center of their cluster. So their cluster is where like the leaves are all kind of bunched up and there's a little kind of almost like a circular structure. The center is the newest leaf that grows out of the center, as well as new clusters start around from the root structure. And this is a really great picture of actually showing that new one popping up. We're about to start another whole leaf structure popping out of the soil. I have another little slide about Sansevierias that I want to go into because it's a succulent, right? We always think succulents are high light, low water, all that kinds of stuff. But I have a couple different ways that you need to think about them too. I have a question here. How do you grow a low light plant directly in water? So these plants can grow completely in water. And I just talked to you for how long about how they need to have drainage and they need to be dry, they need to go bone dry, but I can grow this plant in complete water. And that actually comes from the amazing thing that plants do is they can adapt to their situation with each plant structure that they're growing. Plants that grow in water actually produce a water-based root. The root actually has a coating of, I think it's a little bit of a waxier kind of coating as a structure around that root that actually stops the osmosis of the water going in and just destroying that root structure. It actually kind of holds its own. And so roots that are growing in water are different than roots than grow in soil and other kinds of mediums. So when you are transplanting from a cutting, like these are cuttings, I took a bunch of different cuts from a bunch of different Sansevierias that I had and threw them into a jar and put them in right next to my telephone, actually. And they're sitting there and they're growing roots out from that structure. And those roots are totally taking up nutrients, taking up water. I throw a little bit of fertilizer in there every once in a while to keep it going. And it's completely happy in there. And when I want to transplant it to soil to really get it to start actually really growing, you don't get a lot of extra like new growth in water. They kind of just like stabilize. Then that transportation can happen, but there is a bit of a adaptive period where those roots kind of have to reorganize and start growing more soil-based roots because it's a different kind of structure that they grow for soil and for water. And another little tip, if you're growing anything in water, every plant that we talk about today, pretty much every plant that we're talking about today, you can grow in water, but you need to make sure that you are consistently refreshing the water. What root rot really is, and we always talk about root rot. Root rot is like I think it's a bacterial kind of or fungal. It's a structure that's kind of breaking apart and kind of making the plants die back from the roots. But what's really happening is because it is being anaerobic. There is no oxygen getting to the root structure. Roots really need oxygen, which seems weird because we always think we're adding water to our plants because they just need water, but they really need oxygen. And when you have them sitting in water for a long period of time, a lot of microbes and a lot of algae and all that kinds of stuff starts filling that little water structure that the roots are growing in, and all the oxygen goes away and that plant actually starts to kind of suffer. So refreshing the water consistently around once a week is wonderful. If you can do it once every 2 weeks or once a month, you're generally okay. And that will actually create a very healthy growth in your water situations. And then right over here, if you haven't been looking at it already, we have two plants that I bought at the same time. And I didn't try and do this, but I ended up doing a little bit of a scientific study where I had one of them growing in this little terracotta pot, had a little chip in it. I just kind of threw it into a terracotta pot, put it on a counter in a room that I don't really go into very often, and was like, it's wonderful. It'll do great there. It's somewhat lower light. It doesn't need very much water. I won't pay attention to it very much and it'll be fine. And to its credit, it is still alive and is still green and pretty happy in the most part. But you can see along the structure of this of the plant's leaf structures there are wrinkles and a bit of almost like puckering that's happening. And that's because the plant is kind of closing in on itself. It doesn't have the water inside its cells to really fully open up. And even when I fully water that plant, it doesn't fill back up. Those structures are pretty rigid in the Sansevieria that you can't just completely reverse it all the way. I do actually have that plant next to me now, and I retransplanted it into the pot that I have on the right side, and it's doing a lot better. It's actually puckering up a little bit more, but it's taking time. Because on the one on the right side, I have in a little bit more of a glazed pot. Glazed pots hold more water than terracotta pots. Terracotta pots leach out water really quickly and they dry out faster. Glazed pots hold the water a little bit more, same with like plastic pots and stuff like that. Also, that plant sat next to my bed and I looked at it every single night. So every single night I saw that plant and I could water it exactly when it needed water. And so it grew about 3 times the size and it grew faster and it has a healthier growth because I was paying attention to it. I wasn't watering it every day, but I was actually looking at it every day. And it shows the difference between our perception as well as the pot style that we're using can really change the growth and the happiness of a plant when I got those plants at the same exact time. So in general, they are very tolerant to underwatering, but they still can react if you don't pay attention to them at all, or if you don't water them at all, they will shrivel up. Okay, Sansevierias. We'll keep on moving along. If you have some more questions about them, we can definitely go into that near the end. And I can always talk about Sansevierias. They're a very cool plant. Let's go into another really awesome one, our vining aroids. So I was going to call this section our pothos section, but looking more into it, I found out that pothos is actually more specifically one plant, the Epiprimnum aureum, which is this one right on this side right here. It's also called the golden pothos, or it's a couple other names for them. That's actually what a pothos is. Although I call every plant that looks like that also a pothos, and everyone's usually fine with that. But I'm going to be a little bit more specific in this class where we're talking about vining aroids. Scindapsus and Epiprimnums are the ones that most people consider the pothos. And I wanted to focus a little bit more. I didn't want to go too crazy and throw in all the different ones out there, all the Hoyas and all the Monsteras and philodendrons and all the different ones. We're going to focus a little bit more right now. But a lot of these tips can actually help out with all those different plants. Those green heart-shaped leaf vining plants are all fairly similar in a lot of ways. So they like a moderate water compared to the Sansevieria, which is, I would consider really low in that water needing. Vining aroids in general like a moderate water, which means you want to water them maybe every week or every 2 weeks or something like that, depending on your house situation. The nice thing about these plants are they're very versatile to their watering. They really don't need as much care or attention as some other plants. They can go really dry. They can stay pretty wet, and they generally will do okay. They might react in certain ways, but the plant will still live. It'll still keep on growing. They are right there in the middle, and they have a wide range or spectrum of watering capabilities that they really want or need from you. When you do water them, it is always good to completely soak that soil. And this is for most plants in general. You want to completely soak your soil and then let it get to pretty close to a bone dry or a very dry state between your watering. But then when you do water it, you want to give it a lot of water. You don't want to give it a little bit every once in a while. You don't want to give it a lot and then never give it any more again. You want to consistently give it a lot of water and then let it dry out. And that's the best way to take care of generally all houseplants, except for a few key ones that we're not talking about today. Another really interesting thing about these plants is they have these adventitis. I don't know how to say that. Either way, they have these root structures on the plants in general. And I know it's going to be hard to see if I'm really small, but if you've ever seen a pothos or any kind of vining aroid like this, you'll notice that there is a leaf that pops out and then a little root that pops out right behind that leaf. And then it moves along around its little vine and keeps on going. But it is producing these little root structures all the way along the stem. And those have a lot of different they have a lot of different reasons that they grow those. They're for grabbing onto things. That's how they can climb up trees or grab onto walls or anything like that. That's how they can also be easily propagated. You can snip off any of those little pieces. And then if they have a little root structure already growing, it's quite easy to get it to keep on growing and get that plant to just propagate and keep on making new babies all the way through, because you can just vine cut them off. They also are just a really good way for it to also grab moisture out of the air. If you have a very humid area, they're getting moisture from both their root structures as well as their leafy root structures, which makes it really easy for them to grow in these more humid environments, they're mainly from like rainforests and areas that have a lot of water, always capable and always in the air. And when we have them in our houses, we need to remember that, sometimes a bit more of a humid situation is pretty helpful. And we'll talk more about that with our next plants too. But they have a really fun, very adaptive root structure on their leaves that we can utilize in a lot of different ways. They also generally like an occasional fertilizer. A lot of plants like this as well. And I'm not going to go too much into fertilizing. And I have some information about fertilizing later on if we want to talk about it. But in general, a liquid fertilizer is quite often used for houseplants. I think it's a little bit easier for most people to throw some fertilizer into a little container and then fertilize your plants through a liquid base rather than mixing fertilizer into your soil. Both work out quite well. They kind of work in a different way, but I think a liquid fertilizer is pretty good for that. And generally, an all-purpose fertilizer is all you really need. You don't need to go too crazy about some different mixes that have these different micronutrients and stuff like that. Generally, an all-purpose fertilizer will just get the job done. And then I have a little slide here to also show something really cool about these plants. So pothos or epiprimnums and vining aroids in general can really tolerate a bit of mismanagement, which I know is like a weird thing to say, and a tips to how to take care of your plants is that you don't have to take care of them as well. But it's just showing that if you are a little bit worried about your plant, or maybe you have a plant that is struggling or not doing too well, and you are going to ask your friends or going to ask the Slope Gardens or whoever nursery you're talking to, and you want to show them your plant, a lot of times we just kind of say, actually your plant's doing quite well. It just needs to be cleaned up. It needs a little bit more care. Just pay attention to your watering a little bit more and you're set. I have 3 plants right here that are in my room at the moment. They're in the corners of my room, or up on a shelf. They're a little bit farther away. And I took these pictures very recently. I took them pretty much one after another. Right here, I have a Epiprimnum aureum jade, which is like the just plain green one in the corner of my room. It's high up there. I can't water that very often. I can't think about it as often, except for when I look up into the corner of my room. And so every once in a while, it gets really dry. It looks pretty sad. The leaves kind of start to curl in a little bit more. And that's why I know, okay, I need to water it. But if I don't realize that happened, I do have a bit of a dieback. So you can see right here, there are brown leaves all the way down this stem in different parts of it. And if I was to look at that and go, oh no, my plant's dying, I'll be mistaken, because really it's just the plant saying, hey, I'm struggling right now a little bit. I'm getting a little bit dry. I can't hold on to all these leaves. I'm going to kill a few of them off and get rid of them, and then just let the other ones live and just keep on growing. Right down below it, a couple minutes later, I came in, I trimmed off a few of those leaves. I even pinned up a few of those longer stems and pulled them up and pinned them into the pot. And they have those little root structures on their stem, right? So I just put those right into the pot, attached to that stem, and that's going to let them root again and actually fill up. And so now this plant down here looks quite nice. It's full. It's going to keep on growing. It actually looks like there's no problem at all. Where just a couple of minutes before I had the browning leaves. This one right in the center is this RM as well, and it had these yellow leaves. They looked a little bit spotty, looked a little bit sad. I probably overwatered it one day and underwatered it another day. It's okay. I came in, I trimmed them up a little bit, just kind of took off those leaves, and it immediately looked pretty nice. If you ever go into someone's house and you see all their cool houseplants all hanging and trailing around, you go, oh my God, how are you taking care of these so well? They all look so good. I bet you before you came over, they went in and snipped off all those little yellow leaves, because they're always present. They're always around. You take off all those little yellow leaves, looks like you're doing great. Looks like your plants are beautiful and thriving, compared to maybe just a little bit before that. They looked a little bit sad because they had some older leaves that just needed to be trimmed away. Same thing with this one on the right side. Same kind of idea. I have it right up above me in the corner of my room. I can't get to it as often. I let it get a little bit dry. This one's even attaching to my wall right now. Hopefully my paint's okay, but it's attaching to my wall, crawling around, and then crawling into my window area. And so these plants will actually find light. You put them in the corner, they're going to find the light no matter what. They're going to crawl around your house until they find a window, and then they're going to be in front of the window and go, oh my God. And I let it get a little bit too dry. The leaves got a little bit on the wrinkle or like the kind of curled side. It's always a good sign of that. It needs a little bit of water. A few of them died back when I let it get a little bit too dry. I trimmed those off. It looks quite nice again. So just kind of appeasing the freak out that can sometimes happen with these plants is, oh no, there's a yellow leaf. Oh no, there's a brown leaf. Totally normal. It often means there was maybe a bit of a drying period, or it's just the plant's going through its life and it's dropping off some leaves because it doesn't need those anymore. Clean them up. Your plant's doing fine. All right, we're going to move on to our next category of plants. We're doing quite well on time here. Ferns. Ferns are wild. They are a completely different style of plant. They have their own phylum. If you think about the genetic tree, or like the way we talk about kingdom and order and phylum and groups and all this stuff, phylums are right at the top there. So they split off early. They're one of the more earlier kinds of plants that we have had on this planet. They have no seeds. They have spore structures. So they are completely different in how they repopulate and work. And they were one of the earlier plants that were covering the earth before all these angiosperms and all these fruiting plants started to pop up everywhere. But they're another plant that we generally consider a low light plant. Of course, because there are so many of them filling this phylum, there's a huge variety, and I can't speak on every single one of them. There's no absolutes in this class at the moment, but in general, they're considered a lower light plant. We also usually consider them a higher water plant. And so higher water just usually means keep the soil more on the moist side. That means keep the soil wet maybe every week, or maybe every couple days in the week. It depends on how hot your area is. These plants actually grow their root structures pretty fast, although fairly shallow for the most part. They can get those little fibrous roots all throughout their pots, and they can soak up the water really quickly, look nice and green, but then they can get fairly dry. So you kind of have to water them pretty consistently. They love a bit of humidity. Most indoor plants love some humidity, so I'm going to say that that's a pretty standard one. But ferns in general, if you have a nice kind of good watering source and you have a bunch of plants all around your house, I think the most humidity you can actually get really easily is just have a lot of plants. The room I'm in right now is fairly humid because I just have a lot of plants that are all transpiring water into the air, and they're actually helping each other create the climate that they would like to grow in. And they also like to be fertilized every once in a while. I don't think you have to worry too much about a fern being fertilized, but like any other house plant, give it some fertilizer during its growing season. Usually that's spring, usually that's summer. Sometimes in the later fall, if we have a nice warm period like we were just having, when the plant is growing, when there's a lot of energy in the air, give them a little fertilizer. It'll go a long way. A couple things to avoid with ferns, and this is also something that goes across the plant world in general, and you should maybe think about with all your house plants, but ferns are one of the first ones to show you that you're doing it wrong, is sudden shifts in temperature. That means windows that are open and closed on really hot or really cold days can be a little bit of a stress for them. Heaters. Right now, it's the time of the year that everyone starts turning on their heater, and they haven't done it for a year, so they forget. And you have a plant right in front of your heater, it's going to be very upset with you. So if you have heaters, or if you have ways that the temperature are going to change pretty drastically in times of the day, your plants will start reacting. Ferns will be one of the first ones to kind of pull their leaves back and crisp up a little bit more. Similarly, with consistent drafts, like I was saying, with the windows are open, or if you have a really drafty entranceway to your house or something like that, ferns can react a little bit to that. Generally, the tips will get brown out a little bit more. Direct sunlight for many hours. Again, it's a low light plant, and it's usually a plant that likes to grow underneath a whole bunch of other plants in some sort of rainforest or some sort of, actually everywhere. Ferns are everywhere in the world, and they will just grow underneath all the other plants. And so if it gets a lot of direct sunlight that super excites their photocenters, then it can kind of react a little bit poorly. And then excess physical contact is really something that when I have to say excess, because they can be touched, they can be moved around. I touch my plants all the time. I love to kind of enjoy a plant and kind of look at it and grab it if you need to, and just kind of like check underneath the leaves. But if you are running by them, if it's in maybe in a hallway and you have maybe kids or you, and you just run by and you smack it every once in a while, they can definitely feel the damage. Palms do the same thing. So be careful of the physical contact or breaking them or snapping them. But the really nice thing about ferns in general is that they come back really easily. Generally, a lot of people are on both sides of the ferns, where either they can grow a lot of them and they love them, or they can't grow any of them and they hate them. And I've seen it's one of the most divisive plant categories that I've talked to a lot of people about, is either you grow ferns or you don't grow ferns. And I feel like everyone should just have some ferns around, and then they'll be okay. They come back from desiccation or drying out fairly easily, but they may not look exactly how they look when you started. You'll lose a couple of fronds. They'll just kill off a few of them or brown away. You snip them off, and they just throw out new ones all the time. So don't be afraid to trim back a plant. Maybe the plant went through a bit of a dry period where you're like, oh, I forgot about it for a week, or I went on vacation, my fern is just looking real sad. Come back in, give it a whole bunch of water, really fill up that water, let it sit for about a day or two. You'll come back, it'll perk right back up. A couple of leaves will die away. You come in, you trim back those few leaves, and you'll start seeing new little fiddle, can't remember the name right now. either way, the little kind of scrunched up new leaves that will unfurl and come in, they'll come back right away. So don't worry too much about your fern dying away completely unless it's been dry for a very long time. And just give it a little bit of that energy, a little bit of that time. It'll come right back. I have two more ferns here that I wanted to talk about because they're a little bit different and they're a little bit fun. The last one is our bird's nest fern. It doesn't look like any other fern that we've talked about today. It has these really ribbony like leaves. This one has a little bit of a ruffly ribbon to them. They're very wide. They have a different look to them. There are so many kinds of ferns, like I was saying, and this one is fairly tolerant to actually maybe a little bit brighter light or even a little bit less water than other ferns. It's a little bit more of a easy to care for fern. If you struggle with ferns, try a bird's nest. I have one right in my living room. It's actually a pretty bright spot. I've also had one in the corner of my bedroom, pretty dark spot. They did pretty fine in either situation. But if you like this kind of cool structure where it's really growing out from the center and it looks almost Jurassic or a little bit older looking, it's a great option for a very interesting fern. And then right here on the right side is our rabbit's foot fern. I think they're so interesting and cool. They have these really fuzzy little rhizomal root structures that grow along the tops of the soil, and they actually curl over the sides of the pots. And it looks like rabbit's feet. Kind of looks like spider legs to me, but I think that's cool. And another interesting thing about them is that those little root structures, that's where the leaves are coming out of. You can break them off and propagate them really easily. This is actually not my fern. This is one of my best friend's fern. And she has always told me that she's worried and doesn't care for plants very well or doesn't think she can take care of them, but she takes care of this one perfectly. It's one of her favorite plants because this fern is a survivor. It'll live for long. She's propagated it many times, just kind of taken pieces off, throw it into another pot, and they just grow and they do great. So if you want a fern that's going to be really kind of cool looking, a little bit fun, and also you can just make a bunch of them and grow them whenever you want to and propagate them around, try a rabbit's foot fern. Generally propagation through division, through runners, as well as spores, although it's kind of hard to really get a fern to propagate through a spore. I'm not as keen on how to do that. And then, yeah, so I have a bunch of other ferns in my room. I couldn't show them all off. Actually, on this last page right here, on this right side is a tiger fern. It's one of my favorite ones, but I couldn't fit it into the slide very well. It has a very interesting foliage. So the Boston fern is another one that everyone knows about, or the different kinds of Nephrolepis, or even the maidenhair fern, which everyone kind of believes is a little bit more of a diva. It kind of dies away really easily. I find that they come back really easily as well. So give a fern a chance. Grow it in a semi-shaded area, give it a lot of water, and you'll do great. All right. I have some honorable mentions right now. So these are plants that I was going to talk about, then decided that if I had every single plant that grew in the shadier area, this would be a very long class. So I wanted to just bring them up right now and give you some ideas for what you can go into the store and pick out. We have the Dracaena on the side. Again, I said before that the Sansevieria are also now Dracaenas, but these are what we always consider the actual Dracaena. Tall plants, really nice and full of green leaves near the top. They usually come in multiple stalks inside the pot. They love to go very dry. They are perfect for corners and for height in your house in a shadier area. In the middle, we have our ZZ plant. I find this one is one of the easiest ones to grow as well. It's my second choice to a Sansevieria for a client who likes a really easy to grow plant. They have a really cool name. I cannot pronounce it right now, but it is the ZZ plant. And they have these really shiny structures that grow these stalks from the base, and they hold their water really easily. So you let them go very, very dry between watering. It's a wonderful one. And then we have the peace lily. A lot of us know peace lilies. There's a lot of different kind of cultural adaptations where people have them for certain reasons, sometimes mourning for other kinds of reasons, or gifts or something like that. They have really cool little spath flowers, which are those flowers that are white with a little kind of inflorescence center to them, as well as really nice dark green leaves. This is a plant that actually likes a lot of water, a little bit more like a fern. They like to stay wet. They like to be a little bit more cared for and hydrated, but they still can grow in a shadier area. So these are some nice options. And then a lot of our pictures that we had at the beginning of this webinar are some other ones. The Monstera I can consider a lower light plant. A couple of philodendrons, sometimes even Hoyas do great in lower light. If I'm just saying names, you don't really know what I'm talking about. So we can always talk about them in the store. Come in and talk to me, or any of our friendly staff will definitely help you find a cool indoor low light houseplant that you can really love and care for and can grow in an area that maybe you didn't think you'd have a plant to grow. So I'm coming to the end of my general class right here. I would love if a little bit of questions if we have any, and I have a few more slides that we can go into if we want to kind of talk about a few other aspects of growing to like a little more basic kind of stuff that we can talk about.
Hey, well, great. That was a lot of really awesome information. I actually didn't know about the Sansevieria being a Dracaena. I'm a little upset about that, actually.
No,
Um, no, you will not change it.
you're not changing on me. We'll see.
Yeah. I was gonna note too, when you were talking about humidity, a good thing that I do actually with my office plants is I have trays of gravel under everything, and that it's like a humidity tray, and that just it's crazy. It'll feel like a sauna in there after I water everything. So
Yeah.
that's another way to create
Isn't that right?
humidity.
Because a lot of times when we think about humidity, I mean, I think there's a lot of controversy in talking about spraying your plants. I like to spray my plants. I think it's just a way of me connecting and cleaning up the leaves as well as adding a little bit of moisture in the air, but it doesn't do a crazy amount for humidity. I still think it's fun. Adding those trays underneath your plants is a great way of just letting the water kind of evaporate into the air. And like I was mentioning before, having just a bunch of plants around, they're all pulling water into the air and they create an environment around them that is a little bit better for all of them to grow in. So it's a good thing to do. Let's see, I might have a couple of questions here. I have someone asking about how about a bird of paradise? I think I might have lost you, Jen. I have someone asking about how about a bird of paradise? How much water should I give it? And where do I find a water meter long enough for those plants? That's funny. So birds of paradise are actually one of those plants that I find is more of a higher light plant. So it's not one I would have put into this webinar, but in general, you want to make sure that you have those ones closer to a window. And humidity meters are generally if you're ever going to, or not humidity meters, water meters or moisture meters is what they're usually called, are often about 1 foot long. There might be some more in the market that are a lot longer, but if you're someone who is worried about watering their plants and they don't really, maybe they stick their finger into the soil and they have a little bit of a harder time seeing if the plant is actually really dry or wet, using a water or moisture meter is a really good way to get a little bit deeper into the soil. It gives you a better idea about what's going on, because sometimes when you have a plant that is sitting there and you're watering it on top of the top of the soil might seem dry every once in a while, but the soil beneath it might be very wet. And that's a really easy way to actually get an imbalance and a bit of root rot happening if your lower parts of your plants are very wet versus the top part of your plants that's very dry. So in that kind of case, I think a water or moisture meter is actually very helpful. Do I have you back, Jen?
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I went into the black hole of the internet for a second. Anyway, I'm glad you were able to talk through it. You were just talking about water meters. I saw that
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
We have a question
And
about monsteras, right?
yeah, well, this is kind of a little outside the box, but can most indoor low light plants be moved outside in a shade garden during the spring and summer months?
So I think this is a really good question, and actually something that people will say to me every once in a while is like, oh, I put my plants outside for a couple days, or I put my plants outside because I feel like it needed more sun. It really does depend on the plant. I think monsteras are in their own little kind of bubble where they are a very versatile, very good. Like I go back to this one of these first pictures. This is my monstera sitting in my house, and I mentioned that it can be a lower light plant. I got that one a couple of years ago, and they grow very big, but their leaf size and their general aspect of how they grow really does depend on what you're giving them, the space and the light that you're giving them, and the structure. This one, I'm just letting it grow out, and I've noticed that in a slightly shadier area, I mean, it's in a bright room, but in the corner of the bright room, my leaves are only about 1 foot long or so, and it does really well there. I've seen some really lower light or somewhat neglected monsteras living for years and years and years on end, but they just look a little bit different compared to the one that is my next slide, where it has the really big leaf, and it's from an older monstera, from the very top of an older one, which probably got a little bit more light and actually had a structure that it's growing up on. When these plants, when these vining aroids grow on a structure growing up, they get bigger leaves. So in general, when I'm saying these plants are very versatile, when you put something outside, you bring apart a whole bunch of more factors that can really go into its health and its care, because outdoors gets colder during the nighttime. There's more wind pressure. There's a lot more variability of bugs and sun and all these different kinds of things that most houseplants can't really survive in. All the houseplants that we generally grow are usually from the equator regions or the more tropical regions of the world, compared to a lot of plants that we are growing in our area here in San Francisco in the Bay Area are more semi-tropical or temperate regions. And so there's a different kinds of capability. So I would be worried to bring out any of your houseplants outside for a little while. But a monstera, most ferns are actually really good for that kind of variability growing. And a few other ones that we grow inside can be grown outside, but really kind of check in with your garden centers and see what might be the best situation for that before you start throwing your plants outside, because it's a good way of losing a plant.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen indoor plants being used like in the city, for example, where people have those entryways from their gate to their front door, because that's a little more protected. It just depends on your space
Yeah.
and where you are. If you're, if it's a more temperate, if you're in the city or Sausalito or Tiburon or even Mill Valley, I think you can get away with a lot more
Yeah.
dual use or whatever.
It's not a
Well,
question about
just
hanging plants, right?
yeah, suggestions for indoor hanging plants. I mean,
Yeah.
low light. Yeah.
So definitely the different kinds of aroids that we were talking about. So different kinds of um, pothos and epiprimnums and all those. I think the tradescantias, which is the one that they were mentioning in that question, are for sure a good option for a lower light, but also a higher light. I've noticed that tradescantias, which let's see, maybe if I even stop sharing, you can see me. I have a couple different plants around me, so I can just grab them and talk about them. These are plants that are on the purple side. So this is a Tradescantia that has a little bit of a longer leaf compared to some of the other ones we see. They are a vining plant that does grow down and trail around. They are a very fast growing plant, so they grow very quickly, and they can grow in a lower light situation, but I've noticed that if you grow them in too low of light, they lose their color and they get a little more just green. If you grow them too much light, they actually get a lot of purple and then they die away. So finding that middle range for those plants are really good. A lot of ferns are pretty good for a good draping plant. So if you can find some cool matcha ferns or anything that has really long kinds of draping leaves, you can have a bit more of like a trailing kind of look to them. There are Hoyas out there. Hoyas are very succulent looking little plants that actually can do well in high light and lower light. I find that they actually stay more green and really pretty in lower light, but they flower more in bright light. So it's that kind of variability. The plants grow differently in different lighting and they can give you a different result depending on what you're doing. But generally they will, for the most part, live. I can't think of too many more off the top of my head.
I think the string of pearls can take some lower light. I have one in a lower light situation, and that's super drippy looking. If you
Yeah.
want that really like drippy hanging plant look,
It's a
that's
really
easy too.
common one too, right? The string of
Hmm.
pearls is a type of succulent, which again we would think is a higher light plant, but if you give those ones too much bright light, they burn right away. So definitely one of those really heavy trailing plants. Even some of all the strings of blank, string of
Yep.
hearts and string of spades and all those kinds of plants, they like a fair bit of bright light to really get their color going and a really nice dense foliage, but they can grow in a low light area as well and just trail down because that's what they want to do.
Hmm. How do you feel about ivy indoors?
Ivy's
Trailing.
I like ivy.
Oh, you do?
It's a divisive plant as well. Outdoors, it's quite invasive, so do not plant ivy into your gardens because you won't get rid of it. But I like them indoors. They have a really nice, pretty spade like shape and look. Um, I don't have any around me, but they are a nice dark colored leaf. And so if you like like little ivy leaf, it'll trail and do great. And it's one of the best ones for a low light area.